Okay, today is Monday, 9th September, start of another week in the Ukrainian conflict and another week in the increasingly complicated geopolitical situation that surrounds it in advance of the crucial BRICS summit, which is taking place at the end of October. I'm going to suggest that over the last 36 hours, we've had significant clarification about the situation on the Ukrainian battle lines. We have a much better sense of where things are going. And at the same time, I suspect that we're going to see continued complexity in the diplomacy and politics of this conflict running up to the BRICS summit in October, which will also be a final clarifying moment. It is inevitable that in the run-up to the BRICS summit, all sorts of parties will start to make their moves, and each party, obviously, is thinking of its own interests and is trying to cover its position ahead of the BRICS summit. Now, when I say each party, I mean both the Western powers and the Russians and the various other BRICS states. I noticed, for example, that in their joint press conference the other day, the director of the CIA and the head of MI6 were discussing Russia's relations with China, and Bill Burns, who is of course the director of the CIA, said that in time the Russians would come to chafe at the nature of their relationship with China, the subordinate nature of their relationship with China. Even though he in effect admitted that there is no visible sign of anything like this at the moment. It is troubling, to say the least, when one hears the director of the West's most important intelligence agency engaging in continued wishful thinking about this issue. In my opinion, there is no doubt now that the relationship between China and Russia has got past the point where there can be any further doubt that it is for the long term, for the duration. But one also senses that what Burns was probably doing is that in advance of the BRICS summit, he was trying to create doubts in Moscow, amongst some people in Moscow, about Russia's very close relationship with China, its participation in the BRICS, and that he's trying to unsettle the situation amongst some people in Moscow, at least to some degree. I think that the audience that Bill Burns is addressing no longer exists in Moscow, if I have to be honest and truthful about this. I think it probably was there. I think there was a continued pro-Western faction, influential pro-Western faction in Moscow at the time when Bill Burns was the US's ambassador to Moscow in the time of George W. Bush. But I think events since the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2014 have essentially dispersed it, and I think it has now suffered a catastrophic loss of influence from which it will not recover. But other countries are also playing their games, and the most interesting one is India. And I mentioned in a program that I did a couple of days ago that Putin at the Far East Economic Forum in Vladivostok had again discussed the Russian position in connection with the Ukraine conflict and whether or not the Russians would be prepared to engage the Ukrainians in negotiations. And he answered in the affirmative, even whilst sticking to his well-known positions And I mentioned that his tone suggested a degree of impatience and exasperation about the pressure that he continues to find himself under from his friends, and he named China, India, and Brazil, who want him to start talks with the Ukrainians. And he hinted that some of these countries don't seem to understand or take seriously Russian concerns about the origins of the war, the fact that there's been a major civilizational clash between Russia and the Maidan movement in Ukraine, which is irreconcilable, and that the Western powers have played a fundamental role in orchestrating the conflict in their own interests in a way that is existentially dangerous for the Russians themselves. And to repeat again, he mentioned China, India, and Brazil. I think that, in fact, Putin's relationship with China is now so secure, and I think that the Chinese have such a clear understanding of the Russian position that I think China's mention amongst these three countries by Putin was in effect a courtesy. If he'd omitted them from the list of possible interlocutors or mediators over the conflict, it might have raised questions. The two countries that he was talking about principally were India and Brazil. And I've said that I think of the two countries as between India and Brazil. The country and the leader that he's perhaps most worried about ultimately is President Lula of Brazil, who is anxious to maintain and preserve his relations with the United States. But of course, Putin has to think about India as well, and Prime Minister Modi in particular. And of course, Prime Minister Modi has his own concerns. It is important to say that despite Putin's frustration about the fact that the Indians appear to show less understanding or interest in the historic causes of the war, my own view is that Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government is fully aware of them, but as an emerging superpower, one which has to maneuver very carefully on the international stage, Prime Minister Modi's government has to be concerned about its overall position. It does not want to give the impression to the United States that it is joining some kind of alliance against it with with Russia and China. And of course, Prime Minister Modi also has domestic concerns in that there is a significant Atlanticist current within the political forces that support the BJP, his party. As I understand it, much of this is focused around a section of the business community in Mumbai, and Prime Minister Modi cannot afford to completely ignore the opinions of these people who are powerful backers and supporters of his party, and who most emphatically do still hanker for strong relations with the United States. So, despite President Putin's frustration, Prime Minister Modi, for his part, is obliged to navigate and to negotiate and to create and foster the impression that he is not in Putin's pocket, that he's prepared to retain his own separate views about Ukraine and about the conflict there. And he also wants to present himself not as an ally of Russia in the conflict, but rather as a potential peacemaker. And if one looks at Modi's position objectively, if one understands, as a foreign policy realist would need to do, that India and Prime Minister Modi have their own interests, then it becomes quickly clear why Prime Minister Modi is taking this kind of stance. Anyway, all of this leads up to news that appeared yesterday in the Indian media, which is that the the Prime Minister Modi's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, is apparently visiting Moscow this week. And there's been considerable commentary in the Indian media that Doval is going to Moscow as Modi's emissary in order to promote negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is almost certainly a significant overstatement of the actual position. In fact, the reason why Doval is going to Moscow is because there is going to be in Moscow this week a meeting of national security advisors of all of the key BRICS states. The national security advisors of Russia, China, Brazil, India will all be there, and they're going to have a summit meeting and they're going to discuss matters together. And the chair will be the national security advisor of Russia, of President Putin, who is, of course, the former Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. He will be chairing this meeting. And this is, I suspect, a long-scheduled and long-prepared meeting. So, irrespective of Prime Minister Modi's diplomatic maneuvers over Ukraine, it is almost certain that Doval would be travelling to Moscow anyway this week. Just to say. Now, beyond that, I strongly suspect that Doval will want to discuss with the Russians the Ukrainian conflict. It is inconceivable that he will not. And he might apparently present some messages to the Russians from Modi. And we will talk all about that in a moment. But the key thing to understand about this meeting of national security advisors, and the key reason why Doval and the Chinese, Brazilian and South African national security advisors are in Moscow or going to Moscow this week, is because beyond that, beyond this meeting, looms the much more important, the really critically important leaders meeting in Kazan, the BRICS summit meeting in Kazan, which Putin has been very systematically and methodically, as the chair of the BRICS, putting together. And this meeting of the national security advisors is preparatory to that meeting. Almost certainly a joint foreign policy document is being worked on. And that will be partly, mostly, what this meeting is being convened to talk about. But they will talk about Ukraine. Modi will perhaps, or at least Doval will perhaps, on behalf of Modi, pass on messages which perhaps the Ukrainians are continuing to receive from the Ukrainians. They will want to explore the Russians' views, and of course the Russians will respond politely and thoroughly, as they always do, given the importance of preserving the relationship with India, and also the importance of keeping India fully on side in advance of the summit meeting in Kazan. Now, there's been a very intelligent discussion of Doval's visit to Moscow in the Economic Times, which is a major Indian economic magazine. And I'm going to read out what it says because I think it provides a thorough explanation of what Doval will be doing when he is in Moscow. And it's provided by, it comes from an Indian source. And it reads as follows. Amid reports about National Security Advisor Ajit Doval's likely visit to Moscow this week, Foreign Affairs expert Robinder Sachdev has said that the NSA's visit to Russia has multiple objectives, including his participation at the BRICS NSA meeting. He said that Doval will carry some message from Prime Minister Modi to Russia's National Security Advisor Sergei Shoigu and to Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's possible, by the way, that Doval will meet Putin, though might be that this is a meeting held in private and we don't get a readout. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, this is what Sachdev said. The visit of National Security Advisor Doval to Moscow has multiple objectives. The first objective is to participate in the meeting of the National Security Advisors of the 10 BRICS countries. So note that Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they're all going to be there. Doval is going to participate in this meeting. So that's the first objective. But I think there are two other objectives which are even more important than the meeting for which Mr. Doval is going. First is that it is expected that he will carry some message from Prime Minister Modi to Shoigu as well as to President Putin. Prime Minister Modi had a meeting with Zelensky. What the outcomes are, what are we looking at? So there is, I think, some movement. I think what India has done, India has changed the gears of its foreign policy in Prime Minister Modi's third term. His first visit to Russia, followed with a visit to Ukraine, and Modi himself has said in a meeting with Zelensky and Putin that India would be happy to contribute in a proactive way for a cessation of this conflict. So I think what we are seeing now are increasing steps by India towards finding not a solution, but finding where the position of each party lies. So therefore, I would think that Doval's visit, this objective is on the sidelines with Russia. Now, the one thing I don't agree with about these comments is that I don't think that the meeting with the other national security advisors is less important. I think, on the contrary, for Doval and for Modi, it is extremely important. And I'm sure, as I said previously, that Doval would have been heading to Moscow anyway this week to attend that meeting. And what goes on outside the meeting is, of course, important, but it's not displacing the meeting of the national security advisors in its importance either. But I think that what Sachdev is saying, that the Indians are not going to propose any kind of peace solution or set themselves up as intermediaries between Russia and Ukraine at this time. But that what the Indians are doing is that they're speaking to the Russians, exploring with both the Russians and with the Ukrainians what their respective positions are. I think that is absolutely true. And can I say, as a former mediator myself, I've undertaken many mediations in my time. That is exactly what mediators do. Mediators go and meet the contending parties, they speak to them, they find out what their various positions are, and they try to see whether there might be any common ground. Now, this is going to be a thankless and, I suspect, deeply frustrating undertaking for the Indians. The Chinese last year set about trying to do the same thing. And President Xi Jinping even set up a representative, Li Hui, senior Chinese diplomat, and Li Hui has been at various times trying to visit Kiev, and he's been many times to Moscow, and he's toured Western capitals, and he's tried to find out whether there could be any possible common ground between the various parties. And he has consistently found that he has a warm and polite reception in Moscow, that the Russians set out their various ideas, which are essentially Istanbul plus the proposals set out by Putin at the foreign ministers at the foreign ministry board back in June, that Ukraine must agree to all the provisions that it agreed to in the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022, and which it subsequently reneged from. But in addition, it must withdraw all its troops from the four regions, from Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, and of course stop its attacks on Crimea. Those are the Russian positions. I don't think the Russians are going to change them in any significant way. In fact, I don't think they're going to change them at all. But they are at least workable ideas. They're ideas that a mediator can take and take with him to Kiev and tell the Ukrainians, like, this is what the Russians want to discuss. Why don't we sit down and talk about it? The problem is that the Ukrainians themselves come back always either with no ideas at all, or eventually with ideas that ultimately revert to Zelensky's so-called peace plan, which is far more radical and completely unrealistic, and one which the Russians can never accept, which is a plan for the Russians to pull out completely from all pre-2014 Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, for the Russians in effect to capitulate, and then for negotiations to be made to take place between Ukraine and Russia, which would be in effect negotiations on the terms of Russia's unconditional and complete surrender. And the Indians, Modi himself, have been infuriated by this position in the past, but the Ukrainians never shift from it. And nor, by the way, as Putin has repeatedly pointed out, and Lavrov has also pointed out, do they ever scrap their decree, the one that they made back in the autumn of 2022, prohibiting direct negotiations with Russia whilst President Putin remains in office. So the Russians are sophisticated enough to know that they can't just slam the door on their own allies and say, look, we are not prepared to talk. But the Ukrainians, who are in a far worse position, and in a position which is deteriorating all the time, never show any willingness to not just to make concessions, but to accept the underlying realities of the whole situation. Anyway, Doval then, Sajdev then actually had more to say about what Doval might do whilst he is in Moscow. And it was extremely interesting. He said this: the other objective, I think, of Doval being in Moscow would be to meet with China's national security advisor. This is a meeting of BRICS NSAs, so China's NSA will be there, and Doval will want to see and explore if a summit meeting or a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping and Modi can happen in October on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan, to which Prime Minister Modi will be going, most probably. Xi Jinping is also coming. So this could be an opportunity for Doval to discuss with China, with the Chinese, and to do the homework, if the situation is ready and right, that a bilateral sit-down between Modi and Xi could happen in Kazan in October. And this, I think, is also true. This, I think, is very much what the Indians want, what Modi wants. I think that the Indians at some level, at this time, want to try and find some way, what the Indians want to do is find in some way, some mechanism whereby they can at least stabilize the situation with China in the Himalayas on the northern border, thereby making it easier for Modi to address his domestic constituencies and say that Indian interests are not being sacrificed, even as India moves forward into deeper integration with the BRICS. And Subchav goes on to say some very interesting things about India's complicated relationship with the West and with the Russians and the Chinese, and what we can realistically expect from the Indians. The point is, now he's talking about the West, the point is they want India to push for a ceasefire on terms which is favourable to Ukraine and NATO. India will not do that. India, if it does, will play the role of an honest broker or a moderator or positions between all countries. So on the one hand, the West should be happy that India is playing an increased and proactive role with regards to the Russia-Ukraine situation. They will be looking forward and will want to see what the outcomes are. But I think they could be even a little unhappy. Because you see, when Putin says that he will be happy to see India, China and Brazil help in the mediation to resolve the war, what Putin is signalling is that a shift away from the West, that is the countries of India and China which can resolve this conflict, and not countries of Europe, is taking place, the Europeans having played the role of traditional peace brokers. So, in effect, what we're being told here is that this is all about bringing together the BRICS. It's not even ultimately about Ukraine itself. Modi needs diplomatic cover whilst he moves forward with Putin to promote the BRICS agenda. And he's got to do that despite India having a complicated relationship with China, which he's most likely keen, if not to resolve, at least to stabilize and improve. And of course, Modi has to think about his domestic constituencies, his pro-American constituencies, and he has to consider also the relationship with the Western powers, the United States, first and foremost, which India cannot simply afford to disregard or antagonize at this particular juncture in its ongoing rise. Now, having said all of this and having spent time explaining the Indian position, and by the way, there is another almost equally good discussion about this from the Indian commentator M.K. Badrukumar. He discusses this whole topic in an excellent article titled "Russia Offsets Ukraine's Kursk Offensive," and he spoke about how went on to, just to say, Putin went on to discuss potential mediators. He singled out 3 BRICS member states, China, Brazil and India. Putin said Russia, this is from BRICHUTE, has trusting relations with these countries, and he himself is in constant contact with his counterparts with a view to help understand all the details of this complex process. And BRICHUTE grasps the point about Putin's exasperation. Putin is distressed that he's constantly being told by them about the human rights situation due to the conflict, Russia's violation of Ukraine's national sovereignty, and so on. He regrets that they overlooked the genesis of the conflict, the 2014 US-backed coup d'etat in Ukraine, which was resisted by native Russian speakers and by native speakers of Russian language, and over the suppression of Russian culture and traditions. And he made clear also, Putin did, his skepticism of Western mediation efforts, and is, again, according to BRICHUTE, wary that the BRICS partners are beating their luminous wings in the void without comprehending that the conflict in Ukraine is a civilizational war. But he is also a master tactician, and he will insist that Ukraine is open to dialogue with Ukraine, which is, of course, also a statement of fact, given the growing pressure on Russia from the global south, but that he does not harbour any hopes of Zelensky meeting the prerequisites conducive to peace talks, which Putin outlined at a meeting with his senior officials at the Russian Foreign Ministry on June 14th. And as BRICHUTE correctly says, since then, new ground realities have also appeared. So we can see that BRICHUTE, extremely astute Indian commentator and observer of the scene, also understands this situation very well. Now, there is one point I want to make here, and it goes back to Ukraine and the way in which the Ukrainians are catastrophically mishandling their foreign policy, and the way that this can also be said about the West. Because we can see how, despite the fact that the Russians are ultimately going to handle the situation with Modi and potentially with Lula successfully, they're going to continue to keep the global south on side. Putin may at times be impatient and exasperated with his friends at having to explain the same thing over and over and over again, but he undoubtedly also understands the pressures that they too are under, and he also realizes that it is in his interests and in Russia's interests that he be respectful and understanding of their concerns and show this, and that he doesn't just, as I said, shut the door in their faces. Anyway, this would have been far more difficult for Putin to do. It might even have been impossible for Putin to do if the Ukrainians and their Western backers had not been taking such an extreme, absolutist, maximalist position. If the Ukrainians, for example, had come along and said to the Indians, the Chinese, the other countries of the global south, look, we understand Russian security concerns. We are prepared to meet some of the concerns that Russia has. We accept, for example, that Donbass should be an autonomous territory within Ukraine, that perhaps the Russians should be allowed to station troops there, that there should be specific permissions or provisions given for the protection of the Russian language in Ukraine. We accept also that the Russians have a point when they worry about NATO. The Ukrainians could have said all of these things. They might have been completely insincere about what they were saying. But if they had said them, one can see how that might have caused the Russians serious difficulties. But the Ukrainians have not done that. They find it impossible to do so. They act as if everybody around the world should simply accept and agree to their most maximalist demands, however fantastic and unrealistic they are. And the result is that they're making Putin's job much easier than it might otherwise have been. And the same applies equally to the West. I go back to that meeting of the security chiefs, the intelligence chiefs, the British and American intelligence chiefs. It was wholly without substance. No new ideas came out of it. No proposals for diplomatic initiatives, attempts to scare the Russians over the Chinese. A fantastic story about the Russians threatening to use nuclear weapons in the autumn of 2022. If you read Bill Burns' comments carefully, you will see that in fact the Russians never at any time threatened to use nuclear weapons in the autumn of 2022. Some people in Washington apparently thought that during the period of Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive in September 2022, some people in Moscow might have had that idea. That is almost certainly wrong. I've seen no evidence of this. The Russians have denied it. So this story, which never dies, is almost certainly a figment of the Western imagination. But on the actual substance, on trying to find some kind of diplomatic way out of the war, they had nothing to say. And Badra Kumar about it makes this point. In this context, the extraordinary first ever joint piece by the spy chiefs of the CIA and MI6, which appeared in Saturday's Financial Times, shows that beneath wordplay and hyperbole, the Anglo-American strategy is in a cul-de-sac. Bill Burns and Richard Moore cannot even bring themselves to articulate what Biden's objectives are, despite admitting that staying the course is more vital than ever. Burns and Moore hinted that covert brackets terrorist operations by Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, are the options left now in the proxy war. That is true, by the way, and a very disturbing possibility it is as well. But Badra Kumar says, what a Shakespearean fall for a superpower. And of course, I agree. Anyway, complex, ingenious diplomacy from India, the rising superpower, one that is, I think, with considerable skill, negotiating its way round the rapids and problems of this crisis. From the Western powers, nothing at all. Repeat, endless repetition of the same talking points. Every so often, they come up with the mantra that the conflict must end with negotiations. Lloyd Austin did so again a couple of days ago. But when you peer under the surface, what you get is that old, stale, pointless, unrealistic, fantastical Zelensky peace formula, which the Western powers united around, and which is not a peace formula at all, one which, whenever it's brought up, infuriates and exasperates the global south, the Chinese, the Indians, everyone else, but which the Ukrainians and the Western powers seem incapable of leaving behind them. Anyway, this has been a long discussion about the diplomacy at the moment. I think my own sense is that once the BRICS summit in October is out of the way, we will see this abate. The agreements will have been done, the things will have been sorted, everybody will be moving forward with whatever has been agreed in Kazan. The leaders will be there. Almost certainly Xi Jinping and Modi will indeed meet. And then the need to placate the Americans and the domestic constituencies, both in India and Brazil and in other places, will have passed, and the BRICS states can get on with their work. But between now and then, we will have quite a lot of this going on, and it'll be frustrating for the Russians and time-consuming for them. But they have the skill and the experience and the patience, as they have repeatedly shown, to deal with it. Anyway, let's now move to the situation on the battlefronts, because here I'm going to say that we've had a great deal of clarification about the ongoing situation in the battlefronts in Ukraine, and everything that we have learned over the last 24 hours is points to continued Russian advance. Now, the most extraordinary thing, the one that I must admit has taken me completely by surprise, is claims from the Russians that the entire narrative that we've been spun, this entire story of a momentary Ukrainian breakthrough in New York, the Ukrainians, that the 12th Azov Brigade somehow achieved a breakthrough in New York, managed to clear a road, push through to the industrial zone, to the area where there's the famous plant, which the Russians captured some time ago, and where there's supposedly Ukrainian soldiers still holding up. That entire narrative is untrue. And in fact, yesterday I saw a picture which appeared to show Russian soldiers moving around the very area where the Ukrainian breakthrough is supposed to have happened, and perhaps demonstratively raising the Russian flag, as if to say that no breakthrough has taken place here. But the most complete discussion of this has been provided by Group of Forces North. One of the most interesting things about the Russian army, incidentally, is the extent to which the various groups of forces do seem to see themselves as team players. In many wars that I can think of, the various groups of forces and their commanders are bitterly rivalrous with each other. Maybe some of that is going on with the Russian army, but for the moment at least, I haven't seen anything of it. And as we will see, this report by Group of Forces North has much very complimentary to say about Group of Forces Centre. And it says this is the report. The Centre Group of Forces destroyed another myth about the successes of the Ukrainian armed forces. They raised a flag in New York. This report calls it Novgorodsk, but I will call it New York, where the Ukrainian forces are not even close by. Against the backdrop of the Ukrainian armed forces losing one settlement after another in the Pokrovsk direction, Ukrainian propaganda has become more active. One well-known agency associated with Ukrainian military intelligence was tasked with showing fictitious successes of the Ukrainian military in the settlement of New York. This news was quickly spread across all Ukrainian resources, announcing the alleged return control over New York. However, fighters of Group of Forces Center, who are in the real positions, have already raised the Russian flag on the northern outskirts of New York. The Ukrainian armed forces are not even close to the settlement. The latest victory instantly turns into an even bigger betrayal, supported by real facts, not internet propaganda. The Ukrainian command, which is trying to hide its failures, is faced with a harsh reality on the battlefield, where it is losing ground every day under the blows of Russian forces. So this is what Group of Forces North are saying about the situation in New York. There was, according to them, no Ukrainian breakthrough to the industrial zone at all. All those stories are untrue. The entire narrative about a breakthrough by the 12th Azov Brigade is a pure propaganda construct. Well, if that is true, then I have to say it was a very sophisticated propaganda construct indeed. I mean, it had an awful lot of people, including myself, fooled. I am not absolutely sure that Group of Forces North is entirely right about this. Maybe some Ukrainian breakthrough did take place, but I'm assuming that within the Russian army, information gets passed around and is confirmed as reliable, and the Group of Forces North has its connections to people in the Defense Ministry. And when they say that the Russians are in complete and full control of New York and that they're telling the truth, and that whatever Ukrainian breakthrough was achieved, punching a line through to the central area, presumably that was an ephemeral event. I would like to see a little bit more information from Group of Forces North, from New York, before I came to a final definitive view about what is actually happening there. But I think that until we do need to take this commentary from Group of Forces North into account. And by the way, it would not be the first time that the Ukrainians have imagined a successful counteroffensive, which never took place. I remember way back in the summer of 2022, during the fighting for Severodonetsk, for example, the Ukrainian media and the media in the West were all busy reporting a successful Ukrainian pushback of Russian troops in Severodonetsk, which never actually happened. So it's possible that Group of Forces North is right, that they are correct in what they're saying. On the subject, since I've started with Group of Forces North, I will continue with them. They're talking about the fact that they're continuing to advance in Kursk region. They say that the most active operations took place in the south, to the south of Sudzha. There were continued advances significantly towards Sudzha in the southwestern direction, and they repelled to counterattacks by the Ukrainians. They also say that there's been a significant advance in the Malaya Loknya, Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye area, and the enemy did not undertake actions in this direction to try and trying to gain a foothold. And that overall, in the Kursk area, the Russian troops over the last 24 hours advanced by 300 meters. And at the same time, they also say that Ukrainian losses continue to be appallingly high, that the Ukrainians lost 380 men killed and wounded in the Sumy direction, which of course includes Kursk, and they give the usual list of military equipment that was destroyed, which does not, interestingly enough, any longer include infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, because if you believe the Group of Forces North, most of these have been destroyed already. Anyway, Kursk remains a sideshow, but an important one. There are lots of rumours that the Russians are preparing a major counteroffensive in the Kursk area, that this will presumably start sometime around October, maybe at the end of this month, and that it won't just be a counteroffensive, but that the Russians, once they've pushed the Ukrainians out of Kursk region, will themselves cross the border and will finally begin the long-threatened advance into Sumy region as well. Well, we will see if that is true, but if it is, then it will be a crisis for the Ukrainians, perhaps greater than any one that we have seen up to this time, and that's saying something, and the Ukrainians will have frittered away their operational reserves in this area, in this offensive in Kursk, and if you believe what my source told me some months ago, that this was all a trap by the Russians to get the Ukrainians to fritter away their reserves in the forests and hills of Kursk region. Well, if it was such a trap, then it will have worked. Anyway, let's move on. Let's discuss what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts. Well, the first thing to say is that we've had a lot of news today from the Vuhledar area. There's been confirmation that the village of Vodyane has been captured, and there's also reports that the Russians are now planning to move north from Vuhledar towards the village of Bogoyavyenka. And this village of Bogoyavyenka lies astride the one remaining supply road that the Ukrainians can still use to Vuhledar. And if this road is cut, and I've said already that if the Russians capture Vodyane, then they are actually close to this road. If this village is cut, then there are no supply routes left for the Ukrainians in Vuhledar, and the position of the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar would become undefendable, because they will run out of supplies eventually as the Russians continue their attack on them. And of course, if this village of Bogoyavyenka is indeed captured by the Russians, then the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar will be in complete operational encirclement. They will be in a trap. We will be talking about an actual cauldron. It will be the repeat of the events of Mariupol all over again. The Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar will have nowhere to retreat to. They will be left with no option other than to fight to the last or to surrender en masse to the Russians. And we saw that in Mariupol, the Ukrainian troops there eventually took most of them, the vast majority of them, the second course. So that's where things stand in the Battle of Vuhledar. If the Ukrainians had a proper understanding, or so it seems to me, of the military situation, of the situation in Vuhledar, I think they would now be taking urgent steps to withdraw their troops from Vuhledar as urgently as possible to Bogoyavenka and perhaps pull them all the way back to Kurachovo, where they will probably be urgently needed before very long. Anyway, elsewhere on the battlefronts, lots of things are going on. And the first thing to say is that alongside the battle for Ukrainsk, we're now getting lots of reports that the Russians have also entered and are storming another small town, which is the town of Girnik, immediately to the south of Ukrainsk. So the Russians have a presence in Ukrainsk. They now control the territory between Ukrainsk and Girnik, and they have also captured Girnik, along with Zelanye Pershe that they have captured a little to the east, the village of Zelanye Pershe that they've captured a little to the east. It seems that there are not many Ukrainian troops in Ukrainsk or in Girnik, and there are still those Ukrainian troops in the fields west of Nivolskoye, the ones who are supposed to be in a cauldron. It doesn't seem as if there's any great hurry on the part of the Ukrainian force command to get them to withdraw. Many observers, commentators are starting to sense an increasingly chaotic situation with the Ukrainian command, that the Ukrainian command doesn't seem to have a clear picture of what is going on the battlefronts, and sometimes its instructions to its various units reflect a sense of uncertainty and doubt as to exactly what to do. I would add that Group of Forces Center, General Mordvichev's force, which has been carrying most of the burden, if you like, of the Battle of Pokrovsk, is going to be reinforced very soon, because the Russian forces, which have been pushing through Krasnogorovka and towards Vuhledar and Kurachovo, are starting to converge with them. So before long, the Ukrainians are going to be faced in the Pokrovsk area with the combined forces of two Russian groups of forces. A force that will probably in total somewhere around 150,000 men. So on the assumption that the Russians probably already have superiority in numbers in the Pokrovsk area, that superiority in numbers at some point, perhaps next month, is probably going to swell to overwhelming proportions. Something that people who have followed the events on the Eastern Front in the Second World War will know about, because they're also one saw circumstances in which Red Army numbers in a particular direction suddenly swelled when Russian advances meant that two groups of forces or army groups were able to converge and combine with each other. Anyway, that is the state of the fighting that we know in Girnik and Ukrainsk. The very fact that the Russians feel that they're able to attack these two towns, Ukrainsk and Girnik, at one and the same time, even as they have now occupied Zelanye Pershe and appear to be pushing westwards between Ukrainsk and Girnik towards Tsukurinye and Izmailivka. All of that tells us that the situation for the Ukrainians in this area is very difficult, and that the Russians almost certainly do have a significant superiority in manpower, and of course in aviation and machines. Just saying. So anyway, this is the situation in the south, if we like, of the Pokrovsk area. Further north, the Russians yesterday, as I discussed in my program, have confirmed that they have captured Novogrodivka, and there are reports that they have now advanced west from Novogrodivka, and that they're in the process of storming the villages of Lisivka and Suhy Yar. There are even claims that the Russians have pushed even further west than that, and that they've reached and have entered another village called Dachenska, which, by the way, is also on the main highway between Donetsk and Pokrovsk, the highway that I have been extensively talking about. If the Russians really are in Suhy Yar, Lisivka, and perhaps in Dachenska, and we haven't yet had absolute confirmation of this, but if they are in these places, and there are lots of reports that say they are, then I think that settles the question about whether the Russians control Kruty Yar and Krasny Yar and Mykolaievka, which lie to the east of Novogrodivka, northeast of Novogrodivka. And by the way, of Grodivka itself, it seems to me clear in that case that they do. So, just saying. So, we can see that the Russians are gradually clearing their positions. Now, clearing their positions in Pokrovsk. Now, if it is true that the Russians have reached the village of Dachenska, then that puts them obviously astride the main road from Donetsk to Pokrovsk. It is also the road from Pokrovsk to Donetsk, which means that it is a potential supply road for the Ukrainian troops in Selidovo. It is probably, in fact, at the moment, their main supply road. If the Russians are also advancing towards Tsukurinye, it's likely that they will be able to capture or at least block other supply roads leading to the Ukrainian grouping in Selidovo. There are lots of reports that the Russians have successfully parried the Ukrainian attacks in the village of Mikhailivka, which is located to the east of Selidovo. It's in fact an outer suburb of Selidovo, and that the Russians are still entrenched in the north of Selidovo. One can almost see how a kind of net is being tightened around Selidovo itself, and that there is a real possibility that the Ukrainian troops in Selidovo could find themselves cut off from supplies and potentially even surrounded if a decision is not made to withdraw them. Now, I think that their situation is better than those of the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar, just saying. But obviously I can't be sure. Anyway, one way or the other, it looks as if the Russians are gradually enveloping the Ukrainian grouping in Selidovo, when it looked as if Selidovo was about to fall, when the Russians were in control of perhaps a quarter of the town and had occupied its eastern and southern areas. The Ukrainians rushed troops to Selidovo. They managed to push the Russians back. They were then stopped close at the point where at the entry point to the village of Mikhailivka. The Russians apparently still control the north of Selidovo in this area, and those Ukrainian reinforcements who temporarily stabilized the situation in Selidovo, are at risk of having their supplies cut off. So, perhaps overall, not a particularly good idea to try to hold on to Selidovo, given the extent of Russian superiority in this area, and the fact, I should quickly add, that the Ukrainians are dealing with a very formidable Russian battlefield general, General Mordvichev, who is clearly a very skilled tactician, who is able to adapt his forces very rapidly to the changing situation. Just saying. Anyways, that's the situation, as far as I can see, in the Pokrovsk area. As I say, a very complex battle taking place in the whole stretch of territory, all the way from Vuhledar to Kurachovo, to Selidovo, Ukrainsk, Girnik, and all the way north to Pokrovsk. What is at stake is not just Pokrovsk itself, key logistical hub, though Pokrovsk unquestionably is. What is at stake is also the viability of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass and in this area east of the Dnieper River. And it looks to me as if General Mordvichev, Group of Forces Center, and the other Russian troops engaged in the battles in Krasnogorovka and Vuhledar are gradually taking apart the Ukrainian forces in this area, piece by piece, in what, as I had said previously, looks to me essentially now like an enormous battle being fought over a huge territory. Anyway, about the other main place where the fighting has been happening, which is Toretsk, I've already said that there is now real question mark about whether there ever was a Ukrainian breakthrough in New York. Perhaps there was. Group of Forces North say there wasn't. The Russians tend to be, in my experience, rather more reliable chroniclers of events. We shall see. But what is, it seems, indisputable, there's now film of this, is that the prison area in southern Toretsk has now been captured by the Russians. This was a major fortified position. The Russians stormed it, and they have further increased their pressure and the territory of control within Toretsk. This major fortified position that the Ukrainians were relying on to slow the Russian advance in Toretsk has apparently fallen to the Russians, reinforcing the suspicion that the days of Toretsk are numbered. Perhaps by the end of this month, Toretsk will fall. As to the situation in other parts of the battlefronts, well, there's been less news. I suspect that before long we'll be getting important news on Chasiv Yar, where I think the Russians are, as I said, close to capturing the entire town. But there's been less news in terms of what's going on there in Siversk and all of these places. As I've said many times, the fact that we're getting less news doesn't mean that the Russians are not advancing. Often it means that they are. Now, just a few further things to say. There's been lots of technological developments in the war. For those who are interested in that kind of thing, the Russians have developed all sorts of new types of drones. They've been operating in Kursk region in particular, drones that apparently are proof against Ukrainian electronic warfare. They operate on very, very lengthy fiber optic cables. Presumably, they have only limited distance, and there must be all sorts of challenges in operating these drones effectively. I'm not going to try to second guess the technology, but apparently they have been operated, and they have been operated successfully. The Russians have also now started to use their Orion drones. These are similar in some respects to the American Predator and Reaper drones, drones of that size have not, up to now, been very effective in this war. It's been shown repeatedly that in conditions of dense air defenses, drones like this, in which the US and the Western powers have invested so heavily that they're not really viable. But the Russians have started to use them, which may be a sign that in some parts of the battlefronts, Ukrainian air defenses have now been thinned to such an extent that the Russians now do feel that they can use them, and they can use them effectively. The Russians have also displayed another particularly big jet-powered drone. I'm not sure whether it's supersonic or not. It's called the Grom. It is able to launch its own missiles, even as it's jet-powered, and it can act apparently also as a kind of cruise missile. Rather a complex and sophisticated and rather powerful and threatening-looking system. We will see whether it is put into operation on the battlefields. I'm hardly an expert in these matters, but it did not look like a stealth drone to me. So quite how the Russians intend to use it, and whether they intend to use it at all, is another matter completely. The Ukrainians, for their part, have recently been showing a drone which drops, I presume, thermobaric liquid or fuel air explosives on Russian positions, setting the vegetation alight. I understand that the actual practical effect of this drone is limited. The amount of liquid that it can carry is relatively low, and it is in no way can it be compared with the incredibly powerful Russian TOS-1 and TOS-1A and perhaps TOS-2 and TOS-3 systems that the Russians use on the battlefronts, rocket launching systems, which have had such devastating effect on Ukrainian positions. But anyway, this Ukrainian drone certainly is spectacular when one sees it in operation, though the fact that it moves across the sky like a kind of burning flame, I would presume must make it a fairly easy target to identify for the Russian air defenses. So lots of things like this going on. I'm not perhaps the most erudite person about these matters. I don't propose to discuss them in any more detail. People who are interested in that sort of thing can no doubt find a lot more about it. The other thing is, on a technological and industrial level, the Russians have produced their first lithography machine. Now, I've talked about the Russian chip industry many times. I've said that the Russians do in fact produce chips. There's been much comment, talk about this issue, much misunderstanding about this. The Russians produce chips, but they use lithography machines, or have done up to now, which they have imported from places like Japan and the Netherlands. And like pretty much everyone else. The United States, by the way, does the same. And the Russians now have started producing their own domestically built lithography machines. The first one that is now apparently in production and is in commercial use operates on the 350 nm topology, which most people would say is fairly basic. It's a level that the Dutch especially, have long since surpassed. But of course, this is the first such lithography machine that the Russians have produced. And they say that they will be producing another more advanced machine in 2026, which will bring topologies. It'll operate on 130 nm topologies, and the one other machines will follow very shortly after, capable of achieving 90 to 65 nm topology. Now, I've told by people who understand these things better than me, that once you reach the 90 to 65 level, nm level of topology, the 28 nm topology is within your reach, very quickly within your reach. That's the level the Chinese, by the way, have stably achieved. And the vast majority of chips that the military uses, for example, fall within the area of 28 nm topology. So the point is not that the Russians are behind in lithography machines. Of course they are. They've never built them before. It's that they are now building them. This is exactly in line, by the way, with a rather interesting summary I read a few months ago, setting out the Russian program for developing their own chip-based industries, converting entirely to Russian manufacturing systems, including lithography machines. And it seems that the program is proceeding pretty much on schedule, with the Russians expecting to achieve complete self-sufficiency in chips down to 28 nm topology by 2030. Now, having said that, we're obviously not here talking about the very advanced chips, the ones that use extreme ultraviolet topography, the ones that only the Dutch make, the ones that the Dutch obtained the license to make from the US, which are, at the base of the chips that are produced in Taiwan, and which are used in the various smartphones and things like that, the very advanced smartphones. So the Russians are not close yet to building machines like this. I suspect that by now the Chinese are an awful lot closer. In my opinion, the problem for the Russians, the Chinese, and anyone else who wants to build these very, very advanced machines is not understanding how they're built. You can find lots of explanations of what they do right across the internet in open sources. It's a question of establishing the supply chains necessary to work towards building these machines. And my guess is that the greatest problem that is faced by countries like China and Russia in building these extreme ultraviolet lithography machines is the mirrors that are apparently an integral part of this process, which are produced for the Dutch machines by the German optics company, Carl Zeiss. Now, the Russians, for the record, have had a significant history in advanced optics. They might, in fact, I've no doubt, eventually they will get there. Where the Chinese are with optics, I don't know. Again, with the necessary resources, I'm sure they will get there. Most likely the Chinese and the Russians are collaborating on all of these plans already. The Russians are talking about a new technology called photonics, which anyway makes this whole system of making chips using lithography machines obsolete. I have no basis understanding of this, so that I'm not really able to discuss this question intelligently. What I am going to say, and I am confident about, is that by the early 2030s, at the latest, as a result of all of these sanctions, the West will have conclusively lost whatever momentary advantage it has in chips, high-end chips, AI, computers, and all of the rest. Their sanctions have simply incentivized the Chinese and even the Russians, who of course have far fewer resources than the Chinese, to produce the same sort of machines and the same sort of technologies that previously were exclusive to the West. So this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by checking out our shop, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.